we flying?
Well, I mean, quite fast and absolutely definitely at unprecedented speed compared to vaccines in the past. In the past, one of the fastest some of the fastest vaccines have taken 4 years, and that's been a record time for vaccines. And this is we're trying to compress the timeline from start to finish, to less than a year, which is absolutely totally unprecedented. And one of the reasons that we were able to do some of that was that there's now developed a series of vaccine, they call them platforms, they're kind of ready-made technologies that you could take that technology and make a vaccine. And one of them that's gotten some of the most attention is messenger RNA, which essentially puts the genetic instructions for making a vaccine into the body and makes your own body into a bit of a vaccine factory. And that can be, the advantage of that technology is the early stages in devising the vaccine can be done very fast. And that's Moderna and that's Pfizer.
Riley, you cover the drug makers, among other things, but he mentioned two companies right there that are kind of in the lead. What are the other ones? Help us understand who's in this pack.
Well, broadly speaking, there are more than 190 vaccines in development, according to the World Health Organization, and 42 of those are in late-stage clinical trials. The ones that Bob mentioned may be familiar: Pfizer and its partner BioNTech, Moderna, AstraZeneca, and the University of Oxford, and Johnson & Johnson, more recently, just last month, also entered late-stage clinical trials. So these are the ones we're watching to see if they read data out before year end. But there's certainly a second wave of vaccines that are going to be differentiated and aren't necessarily gunning for speed, but for impact. And those will be ones to watch next year too.
So we have questions from the audience that are already come in, and one that's jumping out at me from Norman's that I want to put out to the group. Vaccines have to be super safe. And Drew, you talked about this already a little bit. Can this be fully insured at the speed that these are being developed? Drew, you want to take that?
Yeah, I mean, the easy answer is no. When you look at how these vaccines are first likely to be approved, it's going to be, the FDA has said they're going to have 2 months median safety data to follow up. That leaves you with still plenty of questions. I think the FDA typically likes to see about 6 months, and the process by which these are going to go through is it's called an emergency use authorization, or an EUA. It is very definitionally an emergency effort that the government is able to take in times of crisis that allows a slightly different risk-benefit trade-off based on less data and less certainty, not the FDA's typical gold standard. They're going to do as much as they can to know about the safety and efficacy of these vaccines, but it is, by its very definition, the criteria that these are going to get reviewed under, less thorough than what they would typically do. I think there's a story out there that one of Merck's, the godfathers of Merck's vaccine program said, he wasn't comfortable really about the safety of a vaccine until something like 3 million people had gotten it. And, we're going to be nowhere near that in the early days of these vaccines.
Bob, here's another one from Jennifer. How will efficacy, which is a word that I think bears a little definition there, and potential long-term effects be tested given the accelerated development cycle?
So what they are doing, Drew mentioned the emergency use authorization, and what they are doing in terms of the vaccines, the FDA has sort of asked for kind of an in-between standard. They have asked for the vaccines more data than you might need for emergency use authorization for a drug, which was sort of a standard, developed for like anthrax attack or a chemical attack, some kind of true emergency situation. They're actually, even for the vaccine emergency authorization, asking for additional data. So there will be clinical trials of at least 30,000 patients that are ongoing now for all the vaccines. And some of the trials are up to 60,000 patients. And basically, in those trials, the volunteers, healthy volunteers, and these are almost all adults, they either get the vaccine shot or a placebo. And then basically the trials, and the patient and the volunteers, they don't know which they've gotten. And then you just basically wait to see how many cases of COVID-19 accrue, symptomatic COVID-19 accrue in the patients that got the vaccine versus the patients that got the placebo. And you're certainly hoping that almost all the vaccine, the coronavirus cases are in the placebo group. And that's how these trials are working. So they will show, short-term efficacy.
Okay. And I got a follow-up question, I think, from Kate here that I'll throw out to the group. How effective will the vaccine have to be in order to significantly reduce risk and for us to all move forward, bearing in mind, the flu vaccine somewhere around, half effectiveness?
Well, I'll start with that. So the FDA has asked at a minimum standard, the vaccine has to be at least 50% effective in reducing symptomatic COVID-19 cases. Now there's kind of a big debate about how mild will you get in your definition of symptomatic cases, and one worry that some researchers have is that you could have a vaccine that's rushed out that's really good at preventing mild cases, but doesn't help as much in older elderly people with pre-existing conditions are likely to get severe cases. That's really something to watch very carefully. And that's a very good question about the efficacy and how good it has to be. And that's something, that's just a total unknown right now. What kind of efficacy will these have? Will it be more like measles vaccine that are almost incredibly effective, or will it be more like flu vaccine that's really quite partially effective in some years? And that's an unknown.
Riley, when you talk to the drug makers, what kind of threshold are they shooting for?
It's a wonderful question. To the binary that Bob just set out there, I spoke with CEO Albert Bourla, who sees this more as a flu shot type approach. He's imagining a scenario in which we need a flu vaccine like coronavirus vaccine indefinitely into the future. And so what that brings up is what is going to be the next iteration of a business model for a COVID-19 vaccine. Amid the pandemic, these companies many of them have said that they are going to offer this on a not-for-profit basis. Like Pfizer, they're charging the U.S. government $40 for a 2-dose regimen. But that's not going to hold into the indefinite future. And a lot of that is contingent on these questions of efficacy.
So I think it bears a moment here, Bob, that if you could help, you're such a gifted journalist when it comes to science. Can you break down sort of the scientific approaches behind these various vaccines a little bit? We've mentioned a couple technologies and a couple companies, but I think thinking about how the science behind the scenes here works, I think would be a good moment to do that.
Yeah, so there are basically 3 or 4 main approaches to vaccines that are being taken. They're going to come in, I guess, several waves. The first, and what looks like it's the first and farthest along, is, as we said before, some of these messenger RNA vaccines, and that is a sort of a totally new technology. There's no approved vaccine or even drug, anywhere out there based on that, anywhere in the world. So this is a very new technology. We don't know very much about it. And those, again, the Moderna and Pfizer vaccines. So that's one technology. It's furthest along just somewhat by the nature of the technology that allows you to move fast. A second technology, which you see with the Johnson & Johnson vaccine and also with the AstraZeneca vaccine, these are vaccines based on genetically engineered cold viruses, adenoviruses, which are genetically engineered so they can't replicate, but they stimulate the immune system and they bring the coronavirus spike protein into the body where you make copies of it and generate an immune response. The AstraZeneca one is based on a chimpanzee adenovirus, and the Johnson & Johnson one is based on a human adenovirus, but otherwise the general kind of concept is the same. And that's the J&J vaccine is a little bit farther behind. But it might have the possibility of working in 1 dose that could catch up, and it is now in a phase 3 trial, a very big one in the U.S. And then the next technology, the third one that's based on, very kind of tried and true modern technology called protein subunit vaccines. That's being developed by at least a bunch of companies, but the 2 that are farthest along are Sanofi, and then there's Novavax, another U.S. company, and those are called protein vaccines. They're literally introducing essentially the coronavirus spike protein into the body, and then with that they'll have something called an adjuvant that's an immune booster that'll go into the body with it to stimulate the immune system. And those are, somewhat farther behind. They're not in the U.S., not in the full phase 3 trials yet, but that is kind of a tried and true technology. It's worked for lots of things before, so people have confidence that if a vaccine works, that this type of vaccine is likely to work. And then there's other things that are farther out, but we can talk about those later.
Okay. Thanks for that, Bob. By the way, we've had some great questions already. I've got another one from Victor just as a follow to that mRNA moment that, Drew, I'll ask you. Since this is, untried, untested, brand new technology that we're seeing in the form of mRNA, what distributional or manufacturing differences and challenges does that approach have that we might not be familiar with yet?
Well, I'll jump in here and then I'll speak kind of generally about how the U.S. is planning for this, and then I'm actually going to kick it over to Riley, who I think knows some of the exact details of these a little bit better. I think the big picture challenge here is that the U.S. has, and the world, frankly, has never attempted a medical logistical effort like this in its history. I mean, you're talking about trying to inoculate 300 million people, 300 million plus people in the middle of a pandemic, to do so within a matter of months while producing tens or hundreds of millions of doses of a vaccine that, we're still collecting evidence on how safe and effective it is. I mean, just from a scientific and logistical challenge, I mean, imagine getting, 300 million, plus of any type of sensitive product out to all of America. And then, not only that, getting them to take it and accept it. I mean, there are just enormous challenges that are going to be here. Flu shot uptake typically in a standard year is, I think somewhere around half the country. And that's something that people, know and trust and is familiar. And we have, years and years of planning and experience with how to do it. This is essentially a whole new ball game, and we're going to be going ahead of it. Riley should definitely talk about some of the storage aspects of these that make it particularly challenging in addition to that.
It's a great question from our audience, and messenger RNA in particular, some of these shots that are closest to market have those distribution and logistics challenges ahead. mRNA requires cold chain storage, very, very cold freezers, as low as negative 112 degrees Fahrenheit. And you can imagine that if you are in a country or a part of this country that has lesser healthcare infrastructure, that might be a very difficult thing to get the freezers, get the placement, and keep the vaccines in a way that will maintain them and keep them functional. So the mRNA vaccines in particular have that challenge. And that's why we're looking at this second wave of vaccines. Merck, for example, wants one that has very easy storage, can be just kept in a refrigerator, can be done in one shot rather than 2 doses that you have to wait certain weeks thereafter. Companies are approaching this differently. Some want to be first, and some just want the distribution hurdle to be surpassed. And that's something we have to keep an eye out, because it's not enough to say this works, but how are people going to get it?
Joel, if I can jump back in here, Riley brought up something that's worth expanding on in the context of this question. So she mentioned that most of these vaccines in the early, the early leaders here require 2 shots. I should add to what I said earlier, not only do you have to make sure that everybody in the US or around the world gets a vaccine, then you have to keep them in a registry and figure out how do you make sure that they get the second dose of the vaccine 4 weeks later, approximately. That is its own, doing this once with everybody and checking off the list once is hard enough. Doing it twice and making sure that happens is, it's a magnitude more difficult from just a logistical standpoint. I mean, it is, I cannot emphasize the challenges here enough.
Okay, so Drew, let's stay with that, because that's making me wonder, and what you said earlier, how much hope should we really be putting into this vaccine effort?
I think one of the things you hear over and over again from public health folks, and, listen, CDC Director Robert Redfield, who, while he's certainly taken some lumps and his agency's got some credibility problems, he testified before Congress last month. He held up a mask and he dangled it and he said, even when a vaccine comes out, this is probably going to be the most protective thing you have. When we talk about a vaccine, I think it's important to remember that a vaccine, to differentiate between, mass protection and effect on the pandemic and individual protection. Yes, a vaccine is going to create a degree of, if you go out and get a vaccine and it's an effective vaccine, you're going to have a degree in all likelihood of individual protection. But real, true protection from vaccines comes from essentially they're a shortcut to herd immunity. You use them to create widespread immunity in the community, keep viruses from transmitting. Viruses need to be able to infect people to go out and and cause the damage that they do. So, this is about not just giving yourself protection, it's about making sure all the people around you aren't infected as well. And so that even if you remain susceptible, or let's say the vaccine for some reason or another doesn't work particularly well from you, you aren't walking around a whole bunch of infected people. That means that in these early days, while we're trying to get everybody vaccinated, while we don't know if the vaccine is as effective as we like, those public health measures are still going to be an important component of protecting people. I think that's going to be true, for quite some time. This is not going to be there's a vaccine available, you get your shot, and wow, flip a switch and pandemic over. This is going to be a problem we're dealing with for years. You look at, I'll just go on here for 1 second. I mean, you look at, how we defeated smallpox. It was by vaccinating enough people that we pushed smallpox out of the human population. That is what matters. The virus gets into the human population. You use vaccines and public health measures to push it back out. That's how you kill off viruses and stop pandemics like this. Thanks
for that, Drew. Riley, we're talking about big pharma ultimately here as we talk about vaccine development. And pre-pandemic, probably one of the most hated industries in the world. Does the industry consider this its redemption moment?
I would say absolutely. And you've seen CEOs be explicit in stating that. We've actually written a piece for Businessweek really about that reputational issue. The vaccine makers see this as a moment for redemption. And it's not just vaccine makers, because the ecosystem is so much larger. Basically, if you have something to bring to the table in the biopharmaceutical sector, you're there. Whether that's adding additional manufacturing capacity, whether that's bringing forth treatments, whether that's supplying adjuvants to help strengthen somebody else's vaccines. It's kind of a hard scenario to be a large cap, mid cap, or small drug maker in this moment, keeping your head down out of the race. Especially when the lobby, when pharma and bio, these big trade organizations are also using this as their moment to put out advertisements, to draw attention that innovation starts here in the US in a lot of ways. And that's the campaign that's happening right now. And you'll see that, on the Hill, for example, at congressional hearings about drug pricing, which has been a major issue in the United States for the last decade. Think about EpiPen, think about insulin. These are things that are touted on the debate stage. When drug makers are pressed on drug pricing questions, or when Trump, for example, issues executive orders that might tamp down on those drug prices, pharma companies are saying, why now, when we are bringing innovation forth? How dare you essentially curb innovation in a time we need it most? And so the reputational question is a fascinating one.
Riley brings up this point. There's this wonderful Gallup survey that every year looks at the most liked and disliked industries in America. And the pharma industry has been, for I believe at least in the 2018 data, or whatever the second most recent year was, they were the most disliked and distrusted industry in America. I mean, above they were below lawyers, the federal government. I mean, you name the cable companies. I mean, you name all of the industries that people really are like, oh God, not those guys. And pharma was at the very, very bottom. I mean, this is a reputational reset point. Riley is exactly right. I mean, they have never had a better opportunity to not screw this up and turn themselves around.
Okay, so Bob, one of the things that they have to be talking about then is the safety issues. So what are the big safety issues with the vaccine that they're obsessing over?
Well, I mean, the big safety issue is that a lot of these are relatively new technologies. It's a new virus, and then a lot of the vaccines are using new technologies. So we don't know yet a lot about what the safety is. And we're talking about just an enormous mass, vaccination campaign in a short period of time, the likes of which the world has never seen. And the thing I always like to say, vaccines, it's very different risk-benefit scenario than someone who's already sick, already is early COVID-19 at risk of getting in the hospital or getting a severe case. This we're talking about, vaccinating tens upon tens of millions of totally healthy people, including young adults who, in the 20s are at very low risk of getting severe complications from COVID. And that's just a totally, totally different risk-benefit scenario. And that is a reason why vaccines are studied in such large populations of people. And that's also why there's such a big debate about how much follow-up there should be, even for a minimum emergency authorization approval, and that's why there's a debate over this 2-month standard that the FDA set, and some experts think it should be even more, even for a limited emergency authorization, just because of the importance of having a very safe vaccine. If we have a vaccine that gets out and hundreds of thousands of people start getting it, then some rare but very significant safety issue emerges that could undermine vaccine confidence even more and totally undermine the whole project. I mean, the vaccines only work if people are willing to take them, and you can't order people to take them.
We'll come
to
back
build
to
off of Bob,
Go ahead, Ray.
I want to address
go
it
ahead.
right here and now because I think it's really important. I mean, a Gallup poll just from earlier this summer suggested that 1 in 3 Americans wasn't going to take a vaccine, and that is a massive proportion. And we're going to continue to see how this plays out. But a lot of people are already saying they will not get it should it be safe and effective and available. And that is going to be a major concern in terms of herd immunity. Sorry, I cut out there for a moment, but we need to keep that number in mind.
What is that skepticism rooted in, Riley?
Yeah, I want to be clear in my language here because this isn't just anti-vax sentiment, something that is more politically charged or organized. Vaccine hesitancy can be rooted in real concerns and histories of medical exploitation of communities of color, lacking diversity in clinical trials. Take Moderna, take Pfizer. Both of their early vaccine trials for COVID-19 had more than 80% of the participants as white Americans. So what does that suggest about the people they're testing? What do we know from that data? The later stage trials are absolutely trying to recruit more people of color, more diverse communities, ages, genders, all of the above. But there is a real concern when people line up for a shot. Has this been tested in people like me? What do we know about safety and efficacy? On top of that, those histories. So vaccine hesitancy isn't just a political agenda. It's real, and we need to validate that fear.
And stick with it. How much diversity have we actually seen in the clinical trials so far? Do we know?
So we know more so about the early stage trials because the later stage trials are actually still recruiting. You've got Pfizer, Moderna, they're aiming for more than 40,000 participants. J&J is shooting for 60,000 participants. And they are recruiting these communities right now. They are turning to the NIH, to the government to aid in that effort. They're in Black churches. They are going to college campuses. They are really making an effort and releasing some of this data. Moderna has been fairly transparent in week-by-week basis. How many people have we recruited? But a lot of that might also be related to the criticism that these companies got in the outset with these phase 1 trials that had minimal diversity.
Drew, I cut you off earlier. I think you were about to say something. Did you have another point there?
Yeah, I'll add to that there is a political element here that I think can't be ignored. I mean, if you look back, and for most people, in an ideal situation, like most people don't really notice or pay attention to ongoing drug trials. I mean, it's just not a concern of the public. And, in this case, we have a situation in which, the vaccines that are being developed are being done so in the middle of an election, under the guidance and certainly keen interest of a president whose reelection a month from now, right about when some of these things may be reading out with data, totally hinges on his response to this pandemic, and who, in addition to that, has not been shy about weighing in about setting timelines, about accusing the FDA of secretly working to hurt his reelection chances, of meddling in other scientific aspects. I mean, all of this is, I think one of the truisms of the Trump administration is, there's very little that happens in secret. A lot of times when he's going to lean on somebody, he just does it online. I mean, this is all very much in plain view. And, the result of that is that I don't think it's necessarily affected the conduct of the trials themselves, but it certainly has affected the public's perception of them. And, one of the things that we've talked about, and we've written this in newsletters, is that you verge dangerously close to a world where some meaningful portion of the public, that same public that you need to accept and take up a vaccine, doesn't trust what's going to come out of the FDA based on who's in charge at the White House. And that starts to be a really dangerous place to be in, where, even if the trials are conducted, perfectly, even if the data looks fantastic and conclusive, you end up in a scenario where, as has unfortunately happened in so much of the so many elements of kind of that modern discussion of public life, where information gets politicized and people trust or don't trust it based on what party they're in, at a time when we need them to trust the data and to trust the regulators. I mean, the importance of independent regulators, and FDA has tried very hard to push back on this and reestablish their independence. But I can't emphasize it enough how critical that's going to be for vaccine uptake and getting us to the level of using a vaccine as a shortcut to herd immunity that needs to happen to bring this to a close.
So another.
Drew, I was just going to say, Drew.
Yeah, go ahead.
Drew is stating that health agencies are straddling a tightrope, but who else is? Pharmaceutical companies. We have the U.S. president claiming that he is in conversation with some of the top executives at these companies, and they've come out all together, the front runners in this vaccine race, to suggest that they're not going to submit data unless they believe themselves that their drug is safe and effective. So there are multiple stakeholders who are a part of this in considering what data is transparently given to the American public and to the medical community. And the pharmaceutical industry as well is putting a stake in the ground and saying, we're doing this right.
Okay, so Drew, let's talk about the FDA announcement this week, because that seems pretty significant in all of that. How significant was the FDA's announcement?
Yeah, I'm sorry. You see me rolling my eyes over here because, the folks who've been covering the FDA this has been like a soap opera for months now. I'm going to get a little bit into the weeds, and I'll ask folks to stay with me here. So, the FDA typically, one of the things that it does is it puts out public statements that basically say, here's where our scientific bar is for having a vaccine. And with the emergency use authorization, one of the things that they have been working on and trying to communicate with drug makers is getting a piece of paper that's basically going to say, you're going to need, this much safety data, this much efficacy data, and here are the things that we expect to see out of your application. That's really, really important. It's also a little bit of a moot point to have it public in from some understandings, because they've been telling drug makers this already. But anyways, they had this document. They were trying to get it out because they wanted to put a marker down in public. This is part of their effort to kind of resist some of this political pressures to say, hey, the public, we're a scientific agency. Here is the piece of paper that says what these standards are going to be, and you can trust them. And you also know if they're going to get violated. So that piece of paper has been kicking around inside the U.S. government for a while, and it got sent to the White House for review. And it has just sat there for weeks now. And everybody's been wondering, was the White House fiddling around with it? Were they delaying the release of this for some reason in order to be able to, push a vaccine out through without the FDA having these standards out there? What happened this week was that the FDA basically found a way to do an end run around the White House. They had another piece of documentation coming out, and they, as far as I think we can tell, just slipped these guidance recommendations into that document that they were going to put out. All of a sudden, now they're public. Now they're on the record, and the guidance moved forward. That was what triggered the Trump tweet earlier this week saying, FDA is working to hurt me politically, and tagging the FDA commissioner. It was kind of the latest saga in this, soap opera between the White House and the FDA. But I think it does at least finally put down on paper what the standards are going to be that everybody has been looking to see where they are. The standards haven't been secret. This really was about politics and public confidence more than anything else.
And I'd just step in there and I'd say, these standards are not they're not some super crazy strict standard. Basically, they're talking about, we want a minimum, and about half the patients in the trial is 2 months of follow-up for safety, because there was a possibility of, with some of these trials, without that requirement, that some companies could submit for approval based on literally like 3 weeks of follow-up or 4 weeks of follow-up in patients, and that's just not very much time for a vaccine that you're going to give to millions of people, and you want some time to follow up to make sure there are, no serious adverse events and in them. So that's not like some super long period of time. It's still, the 2 months is still much less than you'd normally have for a vaccine. That is, taking some middle ground and taking the fact that it is a pandemic and we're not going to be able to go as long as we normally would. And the other thing I want to put out on safety, there are examples before where we've rushed out vaccines or came out with vaccines that did develop serious safety problems that were missed. There was a rotavirus vaccine for infant rotavirus, and that came out and was approved a couple decades ago, and then that turned out to cause a bowel blockage in infants. It blocked their intestines, and that had to be recalled after it was brought out. And then there was, in 1976, there was worries about a swine flu epidemic pandemic, and the vaccine was rushed out when the government started a mass vaccination campaign, and that had to be stopped when it turned out the vaccine in about 1 in 100,000 people was linked to Guillain-Barré syndrome, which is a rare neurological disorder that can cause paralysis. So there are a real potential for real safety risks here in a vaccine that have to be looked at carefully.
Bob, can you also help us understand? We kicked around this phrase a couple of times: the emergency use authorization. What is it? Where did it come from? How does one go about, if you're a drug maker, getting it?
Well, you can just apply to the FDA just like you'd apply for regular approval, except the emergency use, the standard is less. I don't have the paper in front of me, but it's like something like, you can apply if it may be effective and it looks like it'll be reasonably safe. So it's a much lower standard than proving something safe and effective. And so what the FDA and the things that have been approved based on emergency use authorizations, the drugs so far, one of which is remdesivir from Gilead Sciences, and that was approved that actually had data from a big trial. But then there's another emergency use authorization that was quite controversial, and you may remember this. This is the drug hydroxychloroquine. It was approved, authorized for emergency use. This is an old malaria drug that President Trump championed back when death rates were soaring, and it was put out for emergency use by the FDA based on really almost nothing. Just that there was a little French quote-unquote study that a lot of researchers I talked to said didn't even deserve the word study. And was put out, and then what happened was real studies came in, and it turned out all the real studies were finding it didn't work, and in some of these very sick people, it could even have cause heart problems, and the FDA was a big embarrassment. They had to retract the emergency use authorization. So now what they're doing for vaccines are basically kind of asking for a middle ground. They're basically asking for something that's beyond the very loose minimal emergency use standard for drugs, but not as much as the standard would be for a normal vaccine. So that's why they are asking for trials, efficacy trials of 30,000 people, and they are asking for, 2 months of safety data on many thousands of people, and they want some minimal level of evidence of cases of severe coronavirus in the vaccine trials, just to because they don't want a vaccine, say, that prevents mild cases of coronavirus, but does nothing or is even for severe coronavirus.
Hey, Joel, can I jump in here? There's a concept that I think would be really good for our that's a basic one, but has some real variation to it that I think it might be good for our viewers and listeners to understand. I mean, when we toss around the phrase safe and effective, I think a lot of weight gets put on that word but I think it's important to remember that, let's say, unfortunately or something like that, hypothetically, I have a advanced cancer and I've been told by my doctors that I have, 3 months to live. I might be willing to take a drug that is going to come with some horrific side effects, that may cause, osteoporosis. It's going to make me nauseous. I'm going to be stuck in bed for days. I mean, but I'm willing to say this disease is absolutely deadly. I'm going to die. I'm willing to put up with a tremendous amount of side effect potential in order to get that. Now, go all the way back down to a vaccine, which is what we're talking here. And when we say, safe and effective, the bar on safe starts to get really, really, really high because you are giving this to people who are well. You're not giving it to patients, you're giving it to well people. And so, you need to know that there is a level of safety, exactly some of the things that Bob's talking about with some of these past cases where vaccines rush out, that is really much, much higher. Now, keep in mind that, yes, there are circumstances that are going to affect all of these judgments, but the FDA, when they talk about this, they talk about the balance between safety and efficacy. They don't talk about safe and effective. When we think about how these are going to be looked at. I think that's really, really, really important for people to remember, because I know the public is extremely interested in knowing, how well do these work? Is there a side effect profile that's worth worrying about? And it's something really important to put in context of all the other diseases and drugs out there and how FDA is going to assess this.
Okay, Riley, I want to bring you in here because there's something that we haven't talked about yet, which is a big deal, and it's sort of in your wheelhouse, which is Operation Warp Speed. What is Operation Warp Speed doing exactly?
So Operation Warp Speed is a White House-led effort that brings together the Department of Defense and the Department of Health and Human Services and all the health agencies within that to expedite the research, developing, manufacturing, and distribution process to bring vaccines as well as therapies to market. They've got the taxpayer dollars behind them, right? So they are deploying capital to secure supply for the U.S. specifically, right? The U.S. people, the American people, not other countries, in a timely manner. And so you've seen them deploy capital to companies like Moderna. They went in early and aided in the research and development. They've put manufacturing dollars to J&J to be able to manufacture at scale. But there are other kinds of scenarios. Take Pfizer, for example, where they're actually only going to grant capital to Pfizer and BioNTech should the vaccine prove safe and effective and receive some kind of approval. So there's lots of ways that they're putting capital behind these vaccines and treatments. They're providing some guidance when needed, but it's a money machine, and it's also a logistical one. And that's where the Department of Defense comes in. They are the brains behind strategizing. Once we have a vaccine within 24 hours, how is it going to get to administration sites? And who is going to follow the 1 to 2 doses that are needed to reach the efficacy intended by some of these messenger RNA companies? But that's Operation Warp Speed. You've heard them a lot. They also have a branding problem. I was speaking with the Surgeon General, Jerome Adams, about this just last night. When Drew talks about some of the political concerns behind vaccine hesitancy, I think that's one of them. The American people hear warp speed, and they get concerned that the FDA and these drug makers might be cutting corners. And the Surgeon General himself has made it his mission to make sure that people aren't confusing warp speed with improper conduct.
And I may step in for just a second. One thing that they haven't done in the have made clear that they haven't so far in the trials. I haven't actually cut any corners in the clinical trials themselves. What they've done is they've kind of done an overlapping development process. In the past with vaccines, you'd do a phase 1 safety trial, and then you'd sit and you'd analyze that data, you'd kind of figure out how good it looked, and then you'd begin a second stage trial a couple months later, and then you'd analyze all that data, and you'd sit and you'd wait, and then begin a third stage trial. So what they've done now, basically as soon as they got data showing it was safe enough from the phase 1 to move into a larger scale trial, they began that large scale trial right away, not waiting for the final results of the phase 1 trial, the results from the blood test. As soon as so they've kind of overlapped steps, but they're still doing all those trial steps. And all those big trials, those are still happening. And the other thing that's overlapping is the Warp Speed's paying for it, is you're not waiting for success to see if it works to start making that vaccine. They're manufacturing all these at huge costs right now, and it may turn out that one of the vaccines isn't very good, so there's like lots of unused doses. That's what's being done to speed things up. But the big trials, they are still happening. That has reassured a lot of people.
And Riley, how much money, taxpayer money, has been invested here, and what sort of accountability is there?
Accountability is a great question. We don't have a lot of transparency into how much money has been deployed at large. The U.S. government and Warp Speed in particular isn't saying this is the total sum. If you go to their website like I have and you tally all of the numbers one by one in your spreadsheet, I've gotten to about 13 billion. But that's only some of the publicly available really big deals. We know that Warp Speed has put money towards some preclinical studies. We know that they're also currently negotiating additional deals. We know that this goes beyond vaccines. They're putting money towards therapeutics too. Regeneron, the treatment that the president received just last week, that's a experimental therapy that has received Warp Speed money. So, I'd love to know as much as usual how much money in total has gone to Operation Warp Speed. But as journalists, we're going to have to, keep to the task and and account for these big deals when they happen, because it is taxpayer dollars.
Okay, just a reminder for everyone to continue to send us questions. We have some great ones, including one that I'll bring in here from Miguel for you, Drew. Vaccine nationalism, actually a huge theme here. We've been very U.S.-centric. Miguel asks, what's your professional opinion of vaccines coming elsewhere in the world, specifically the China and Russia projects?
Yeah, I mean, I think when we talk about vaccine nationalism, let's just say what we mean here. And I think, the counterpart to this is vaccine diplomacy. So, listen, I mean, the U.S. economy, not in great shape. We've seen, even though the stock market keeps going up, very high unemployment rate. I mean, I was down in Midtown Manhattan yesterday walking around. Businesses are closed. All of the things that have happened. I mean, you see us coming to you from our living rooms. We're not going into the offices right now. All of this disruptive stuff that has happened to economies, a solution to that that ends some of that disruption is a vaccine. And so if you're a country that wants to get its economy back on track and be competitive in the world stage and take care of your citizens, having a vaccine, getting it deployed inside your borders is probably one of the most important things you can do. It's a national strategic imperative. And, we talk about how much money that they're spending on warp speed, $10, $20 billion. The reality is that you look at the damage that's been done to the economy around the U.S., that's a pretty great deal. I mean, whatever they're spending on a vaccine is going to be far, far smaller than the net cost to the economy right now. That said, so if everybody is very keen on making sure that their populations are taken care of first, there obviously is just kind of hey, make the world a better place. If you're a government that wants influence around the globe, being able to deploy vaccine to help other economies around the place. The United States sends money around the globe through its diplomatic programs. We have strategic partnerships around the globe. We enter into treaties, trade agreements, all those things. The vaccine is no different from that. To the extent that the U.S. comes up with a vaccine and then can help other countries use that vaccine and get back open. That's one more tool of diplomatic outreach in the U.S. Diplomatic toolbox. I think that's really important. So vaccine nationalism is obviously something that is coming first. I think that's going to be followed up by a wave of vaccine diplomacy. And the United States is not the only power that is going to be competing that. I don't think it's any. China is working very fast on deploying their own experimental vaccine. Russia has its own, and Europe does too. I mean, those are kind of the four power centers of the world right now. And this is going to be one more tool that they use to wield influence around the rest of the globe.
I'll stick with this just a second because we have another reader question from Anwar, which is, I think, a good segue here, which is, at what point can citizens in developing nations expect to get access to a vaccine?
I'll jump in and take this one.
Sure. Go ahead, Riley.
I was just going to say that Operation Warp Speed also has a counterpart on the national stage. There is vaccine diplomacy taking place right now to equitably be accumulating doses and distributing doses. And major global powers around the world have committed to what's called the COVAX facility. The U.S. has not. The U.S. gunning through Operation Warp Speed right now is really focused on the American people. But other countries are thinking about the developing world and beyond the developing world, European Union member states, right? So this is already taking place. But I think if you speak to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, they are focused on this question, but also some pharmaceutical companies. Ken Frazier at Merck, this is a real priority to him, and he'll scream that from the rooftops. He has spoken in several interviews and to Harvard Business School students saying vaccine nationalism is his greatest concern, beyond manufacturing, beyond research and development. His concern is what Drew is articulating right now, which is the scramble to get and hoard vaccines for certain countries and not allow others to partake in that. And at the end of the day, this is a virus that has spread globally. If you aren't safe in one place, how can another country ever be safe? Is a lot of the point that Ken Frazier or the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation will suggest is you need not herd immunity just in Manhattan. You need it really to build out across the world for us to ultimately be safe.
Good question here from Dan. That's a direct follow-up to that. What percentage of a population vaccinated gets you to herd immunity? Drew,
so there are different.
Yeah, go ahead.
There are different positions on this. Some are as high as 70%. Some are as low as 50%. I think the World Health Organization has it around 70%, but we can send out that resource to our viewers in a moment. But herd immunity, and there's some misinformation about herd immunity. Herd immunity is more than just achieving immunity via inoculation. It also accounts for those who have already contracted the disease and developed a semblance of immunity. And public health measures like mask wearing contributes to that too. You want to get to as many people as possible so that the transfer between folks fizzles out. That is what herd immunity is. And the White House at times has made comments about achieving herd immunity via natural infection. Public health experts say that would be devastating. That would kill thousands upon thousands of people. And so we need to be careful in suggesting that any kind of herd immunity via natural means is an appropriate measure.
Okay, so Bob, I want to bring you back in here. Let's fast forward to 2021 because I'm over 2020 already, for the record. How many vaccines could we have in play by maybe this time next year, and what challenges might that scenario present?
Well, right. There could, depending on how these work, and I do want to emphasize again that we do not have final stage efficacy results for any of these vaccines yet. We really won't know until we actually get the results. We're all hoping and assuming that most or all of these work without any major safety problems. We don't know that. If you look historically, development of drugs and vaccines are usually at some point unanticipated problems and things drop out or have snags. And we haven't. The good news is we haven't had many of those yet, but you can't count on that not happening. That's one reason they're trying so many different types of vaccines in case one of these vaccine platforms runs into problems. I just really want to emphasize that. But if these different platforms work, we certainly by next year could have several different types of vaccines out there. The messenger RNA vaccines, they are on schedule to produce results sometime this fall, late this year. Moderna has talked about, kind of Thanksgiving-ish. Pfizer possibly a little before that. Johnson & Johnson's trial is likely, it's a 60,000 patient trial, and it started later, but it's only a one-dose vaccine the way they're initially trying it. So that should allow it to proceed faster, and they could also have, results by the end of the year. And then there'll be other vaccines coming on with results likely in the early springs. The Novavax and the Sanofi, their phase 3 trials in the U.S. that haven't begun yet. So there could be several, vaccines. And the way to think about this is going to be a process. It's going to take some time, even if these work, because the initial emergency authorization, that's not going to be for everyone. That's going to be for a select, limited group of people initially, and there'll be definite supply shortages. And some of the people that might get it earlier, like healthcare workers at high risk, emergency responders, and then elderly at high risk. So you and I, we're not first on the list, and it's going to take a while.
One thing that you and I have talked about before, Bob, and we had in the magazine recently was this idea about having multiple vaccines at the same time, which may tempt people to mix and match. What concerns do health professionals have about that?
So that's a potentially confusing situation that could occur there, right? So like the messenger RNA vaccines, they needed 2 doses, and the second, and at least if the early stage trials and the animal trials are any indication, if there's efficacy, there won't be much efficacy until after the second dose. It's not like you're likely to be able to get 1 dose of mRNA vaccine and be partially protected. It looks like really most of the efficacy only comes after the second dose. So it'd be very important to get 2 doses of those. Yeah, it could be like a very, very confusing situation if you have 3 totally different vaccines out there. And then, of course, there's the other situation. What happens if the first vaccines that get out there, they're partially effective, but they may be only partially effective, or they maybe have a lot of side effects that are really quite annoying. And then a few months later, it comes along a second vaccine. It seems much more effective and a much higher percentage. Will you be allowed to get that second one if it's better? So there's just a whole host of unanswered questions, and it's just not at all clear how it's going to work.
Yeah, but back to 2020, which getting ahead of ourselves since all of those problems remain hypothetical. But Drew, I've got a question from a reader here that I think is an interesting one. I'll take it to you since I know you and I both have young kids, which is, when do kids have a vaccine?
It's a great question. I mean, some of that's going to come down to, when is there the data? If you look at the kind of hierarchy or hypothetical hierarchies of who gets vaccinated first, in a situation like this, they do talk about families with very young children as being a relatively early priority. But I mean, I think with any vaccine, you want to know how it works in a certain population before you start giving it to them. And, that is going to take a little while to figure out. I mean, I think, just from a safety and efficacy standpoint, you need to know, does the vaccine work, and is it, safe enough in a pediatric population before you can go out and start mass inoculating kids? And I don't think we have the answer to that. I believe it was mentioned earlier that these are adults in these trials. And so it may take longer to do that. The flip side of this is that children seem to be at much, much lesser risk from a disease standpoint of this virus, not necessarily from a transmission standpoint, but the bright silver lining here is that unlike some other diseases, especially all these diseases, I have a 4-month-old at home that we've been getting vaccinated as we've been going along. They do appear to be at much, much lesser risk from this disease, and so there is some good news on just that standpoint in terms of when they need to be inoculated.
Here's another question from John that I find interesting. Can the U.S., and I'll add companies for that matter, compel people to take a vaccine? Riley, do you know anything about that?
I would say the answer is no, as of now. And the government is being very careful in its language. I am thinking about this conversation with Surgeon General Jerome Adams last night. It's a nuanced kind of discussion that needs to take place. And really, at the end of the day, the government and companies themselves aren't going to be the entity to make the pitch to the people. We're going to have to turn to local doctors, to pharmacists, to trusted community leaders. The government has made outreach to celebrities. Kylie Jenner, for example, they're putting in calls to anybody who can reach people in a way that is trusted. And if you have a company or a government that is compelling use of a vaccine, I believe that would create even greater hurdles when it comes to vaccine hesitancy.
Joe, I mean, we can't even compel people to wear masks right now. So I
What's right to compel? Okay, Bob, I want to ask you another one. What does this all mean? This experience of like the speed at which we're developing these vaccines. How might this transform vaccine technologies and related technologies going forward?
Well, certainly if these vaccines work, especially some of the newer technologies, the messenger RNA and the adenovirus vaccines, this will really validate some of these new, vaccine technologies and platforms, and then they'll be able to be used in many other things in the future. I mean, messenger RNA could potentially be used for many types of vaccines, including, a faster flu vaccine, which, for example, for flu could be developed faster than in a shorter time period than the existing seasonal flu vaccine, meaning it could have, in theory, have higher efficacy and be more closely matched to each year's flu strain. So, and certainly a messenger RNA, one reason why you see this for COVID-19 is there was a recognition among federal authorities that were thinking about these things a few years ago that this technology, because it could be done so fast in the lab, would be perfect for an epidemic, pandemic style situation. So people actually are already starting to think about, what other types of epidemics these could be deployed against in the future. And they're also starting to think about, and this is, at very early stages and basic science stages, but they are starting to think about, could you make a universal coronavirus vaccine, one that will work against many coronaviruses, because there are like thousands and thousands of other coronaviruses out there. We've already had, 3 different cases in recent years where a new coronavirus has spread to the population. There was SARS, remember, and then there was MERS, Middle East Respiratory Syndrome, and those were contained to somewhat. Now this, which wasn't contained at all, and there's many more of these coronaviruses out there. So they're starting to think about can they do something that would act more broadly and work against multiple coronaviruses.
I got one more reader question or viewer question from Lawrence. I like this one a lot. Why hasn't the FDA allowed the AstraZeneca trial to resume, whereas the UK has? Riley, do you want to take that one?
I'm going to toss this one over to Bob because he's been following it closely.
Okay. Yeah. So that is one of the biggest mysteries out there. And, no one we've talked to really has an answer for that. So what happened in the AstraZeneca trials was that in the UK, they had a volunteer that got the vaccine and then at some point later developed some very strange neurological side effects. And at one point, at least, one doctor and one person, wrote down that it could be transverse myelitis, which is this, rare spinal cord inflammation that possibly could be linked to vaccines. And now University of Oxford says they don't think it's, they say it's probably not transverse myelitis, and they don't think it's linked to the vaccine, but it's a very strange episode, and it's kind of mysterious what exactly happened to the patient. And then there was another patient earlier on that developed a side effect that turned out to be a neurological issue that turned out to be an early sign of multiple sclerosis, and they also say that's not related to the vaccine. But there's a big, mystery about what's going on. The FDA is obviously looking into this very, very carefully, and nobody really knows, but one, issue that the FDA is probably exploring is, could this be a potential sign, of some kind of rare side effect you might see, with other coronavirus vaccines? Because there is a possibility that there could be, let's say, one of these technologies, adenoviruses, have some kind of rare side effects, or even like the coronavirus spike protein itself that are in these vaccines could trigger some sort of rare side effects in rare cases. So the thinking is, and maybe the FDA is looking into that, very carefully. But again, it is a very big mystery why this event that happened in the UK is so clearly not linked to the vaccine. Why is it still on hold in the US? And basically, nobody knows the answer to that.
Riley, what else don't we know the answer to for your last question?
The list is so long, Joel. I think we don't know yet. Efficacy, durability, how quick will the average American actually get a vaccine? There's not a consensus among our government. Sure, we can talk about emergency use authorizations, but when am I, Riley, going to get a vaccine? These are questions that are still unfolding. There are manufacturing challenges ahead. There are distribution challenges ahead. Some of these companies are working on second iterations of their vaccine. Pfizer's talking about trying to redevelop the mRNA candidate so that it doesn't have these cold chain issues. And then for me personally, I think the greatest question ultimately is how many people are going to take it, because we can talk about the science all we want, but if people don't line up for the shot at the end of the day, what was it worth? And that is going to be a push it's going to come to fruition down the line once these are in sites for administering. And that's my biggest question, Joel.
Drew, we've spent a lot of time talking about vaccines. The last question I want to just bring to you is, what other non-vaccine developments should we make sure that we mention here, which could prove to be a bridge before we actually might see the vaccine that we all want to see?
Yeah, the therapeutic question is a really big one. I mean, if you look at, just fundamentally starting from the question of why have countries around the world put these lockdowns in place, asked people to wear masks, and had concerns about hospital systems being overwhelmed? The answer to that is that this was and has been a dangerous disease that can land a lot of people in the hospital and put a portion of the population at meaningful risk of death. A vaccine is kind of the final answer to solving some of this problem. But one of the things that you can do along the way is that if you have tools that make this less deadly, either public health tools, like social distancing and mask wearing, or medical tools like drugs that reduce the deadliness of this disease, keep people out of the hospital, or make their illness less severe, that goes a long way to essentially reducing the kind of spectrum of risk that people have to deal with. If we get to a point where you can get this disease and we know that there's excellent medical treatments that vastly reduce the risk that you're going to die or be in a hospital for a week or a month, then all of a sudden, I think our risk calculation about how we have to ask and act and the steps that we have to take looks really, really different than it did back in March. I think that's worth keeping in mind. People talk about therapeutics as a bridge to a vaccine. I think Bob may have used that phrase earlier. The big thing to think about is that there is not one, fixed point of risk and concern and how you react to it with this disease. It is a constantly changing spectrum, and hopefully one that is always heading toward the safer and safer side. But I don't think always has been. So, that's really the thing I want to leave our viewers with, is that, a sense of, context appropriate risk is important. Changing risk and how people act in response to it is going to be one of the most important things for how people live their lives and think about themselves medically going forward over the next months and hopefully not years.
All right, we've reached the end of our Business Week talks. I want to thank again all of you for joining us, as well as my colleagues Drew Armstrong, Riley Griffin, and Robert Langworth. Thanks again, everybody. And again, thank you for joining us for this program. I encourage you all to subscribe to Bloomberg and Businessweek at bloomberg.com/subscriptions. Follow our social accounts and visit us at bloomberg.com and businessweek.com for our latest coverage. I also encourage you to check out the Prognosis newsletter and our daily podcast there. Thanks again, and please stay safe out there.